By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase defined by sustained amphibious operations and increasing material imbalance. The United States Navy and Marine Corps were advancing westward across the Central Pacific, applying pressure through a sequence of island landings designed to secure airfields and naval bases within range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters understood this progression, but its ability to counter it had diminished steadily since 1942. Industrial capacity, shipping losses, and fuel shortages constrained options. Defensive doctrine emphasized attrition at the shoreline, followed by decisive ground resistance once American forces were committed inland. In June 1944, these conditions framed the situation in the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam formed a strategic triangle. Their capture would allow long-range bombers to operate directly against Japan. Japanese forces on Saipan consisted primarily of elements of the 43rd Infantry Division, reinforced by independent units and naval personnel. The garrison's equipment reflected years of logistical strain. Infantry weapons were adequate but uneven, artillery was limited in number and ammunition, and armored vehicles were scarce. Anti-tank resources relied on a combination of field guns, mines, and close assault tactics rather than purpose-built anti-armor formations. Within this environment, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka served as a staff officer attached to an infantry regiment responsible for coastal defense in the island's western sector. His duties were administrative and observational rather than command-oriented. Each morning, he reviewed status reports, checked communication lines, and walked sections of the defensive perimeter to ensure positions matched the plans issued weeks earlier. His work was methodical, focused on compliance rather than improvisation. Like many officers of his generation, he had been trained to trust doctrine refined during earlier campaigns in China and Southeast Asia. Japanese defensive planning on Saipan assumed that American landings would be supported by naval gunfire and airstrikes of considerable intensity. This expectation proved accurate. What remained uncertain was the role of armored vehicles in the initial assault. Reports from earlier battles, particularly Guadalcanal and New Guinea, had left an impression among some Japanese officers that American tanks were mechanically unreliable and tactically unsuited for dense terrain. The M4 Sherman, the standard American medium tank, was often described in Japanese after-action reports as lightly armored and vulnerable to close attack. These assessments were not entirely unfounded. Early encounters with American armor had shown that improvised anti-tank measures could be effective under certain conditions. Infantrymen using mines, explosive charges, or Molotov cocktails had disabled tanks when terrain restricted movement or when tanks advanced without adequate infantry support. From these experiences, a belief developed within parts of the Japanese officer corps that American reliance on tanks was a weakness rather than a strength. Captain Tanaka encountered this attitude during routine staff meetings. Senior officers discussed coastal obstacles, artillery placement, and infantry deployment in detail, but references to American tanks were often dismissive. Tanks were treated as supplementary assets that could be neutralized through courage and discipline. In one briefing, a colonel remarked that American tanks were large targets, unsuited to island warfare. The comment was met with nods rather than debate. Despite this prevailing confidence, the operational situation was increasingly unfavorable. Reconnaissance reports indicated a large concentration of American naval vessels assembling east of the Marianas. Air raids intensified, and Japanese radar stations detected persistent patrols. Supplies on Saipan were finite, and replacement equipment was not expected. Defensive works were incomplete in places, constrained by labor shortages and constant air attack. Tanaka's routine inspections revealed gaps that concerned him privately. Some beach defenses were shallow, constructed hurriedly with coral and sandbags rather than reinforced concrete. Minefields were uneven, their layouts dictated more by available materials than by ideal coverage. Communication trenches were narrow and exposed. While official reports described these positions as adequate, their limitations were evident to anyone walking them in daylight. In the days before the landing, naval gunfire from American ships increased in intensity. The bombardment was systematic, targeting known gun positions and suspected command posts. Japanese artillery responded when possible, but ammunition expenditure was carefully rationed. Tanaka observed batteries firing briefly before relocating or falling silent. The noise and vibration were constant, disrupting rest and complicating communication. On the morning of June 15, 1944, American forces began landing on Saipan's western beaches. The operation unfolded according to the general pattern anticipated by Japanese planners: heavy naval gunfire, followed by waves of landing craft approaching under smoke. Infantry units engaged as ordered, and initial resistance inflicted casualties on the advancing Marines. From his position near a regimental command post, Tanaka received reports of localized successes and failures, conveyed through field telephones and runners. It was during these early hours that the first American tanks appeared on the beaches. They arrived not individually, but in organized groups, emerging from landing craft designed to deliver armored vehicles directly onto the sand. Tanaka did not observe this personally at first. The reports came through subordinate officers and observers positioned closer to the shoreline. The language used in these messages was factual rather than alarmed. Tanks were noted, positions were marked, and requests for artillery fire were made. However, as the morning progressed, the scale of American armored deployment became clearer. Multiple Sherman tanks advanced inland alongside infantry units, using their main guns and machine guns to suppress defensive positions. The tanks moved deliberately, maintaining intervals and coordinating with supporting troops. Where mines detonated, recovery vehicles or engineer teams responded quickly, clearing paths for following vehicles. Japanese countermeasures achieved mixed results. A few tanks were damaged or immobilized by mines or artillery hits, but many continued advancing. Infantry assault teams attempted close attacks in accordance with training, but the density of American fire made approach difficult. Positions that had withstood bombardment were gradually neutralized by direct tank fire. By midday, Tanaka was able to observe some of this activity from a concealed vantage point inland. Through binoculars, he saw tanks maneuvering across terrain previously considered unsuitable for armored movement. They negotiated coral ridges and shallow depressions with assistance from engineers, maintaining forward momentum. The image differed from the assumptions discussed in staff meetings. The operational problem confronting the Japanese defenders was not a single failure, but a cumulative mismatch between expectation and reality. Defensive plans had accounted for American infantry supported by limited armor. What they faced instead was a coordinated system in which tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support operated together with consistent communication. The Shermans were not isolated machines, but components of a broader operational structure. Tanaka's role remained observational. He recorded developments, relayed information, and ensured reports were forwarded through the chain of command. Official doctrine still guided responses, and orders emphasized holding ground and counterattacking where possible. Yet the pace of American advance and the resilience of their armored units introduced an element of uncertainty that was difficult to reconcile with earlier assumptions. As evening approached on Saipan, the immediate fighting subsided in some sectors while continuing in others. Japanese units regrouped where they could, often under the cover of darkness. Tanaka reviewed casualty figures and equipment losses, noting that anti-tank successes were fewer than anticipated. Tanks that had been expected to halt under determined resistance had instead continued operating through the day. The day ended without resolution. The American beachhead remained intact and expanding. Japanese defenses had inflicted damage but had not stopped the advance. For Tanaka, the discrepancy between doctrine and observed reality was becoming increasingly apparent, though it remained unspoken in official channels. The situation required reassessment, but the mechanisms for doing so were limited. As night fell on Saipan, both sides prepared for the continuation of the battle under altered conditions. By the second day of the landings, June 16, 1944, the operational situation on Saipan had shifted measurably. The American beachhead had widened and deepened despite repeated Japanese counterattacks during the night. Units that had been expected to withdraw and reorganize instead remained in place, supported by steady flows of men and equipment coming ashore. The shoreline, once envisioned as the decisive line of resistance, no longer served that role. Japanese command posts inland received fragmented reports as communications deteriorated. Telephone lines were frequently cut by shell fire, and runners often failed to return. Captain Tanaka spent much of the morning reconstructing events from partial accounts. Infantry companies reported engagement with American armor at closer ranges than anticipated. Some positions had been overrun not by massed infantry assaults, but by coordinated tank infantry advances that bypassed strongpoints rather than confronting them directly. Japanese doctrine emphasized decisive counterattacks once the enemy was ashore and vulnerable. Orders were issued accordingly. Infantry units were instructed to regroup and launch night assaults against American positions, targeting tanks where possible. The assumption remained that American armor would be limited in number and hesitant to operate without daylight visibility. The execution of these counterattacks revealed further limitations. Units assembling for night operations encountered American artillery fire that was rapid and precise. Illumination rounds lit up approach routes, negating the advantage of darkness. Tanks were present even during night hours, positioned defensively but ready to respond with machine gun fire. Attempts to infiltrate between positions were met with overlapping fields of fire. Tanaka received after-action reports describing repeated attempts to close with American tanks using explosive charges. In several cases, assault teams were repelled before reaching effective distance. In others, tanks reversed or repositioned while infantry provided covering fire. The close assault techniques taught during training proved difficult to apply under these conditions. Losses mounted unevenly. Some Japanese units suffered heavy casualties without achieving their objectives. Others disengaged after limited contact, conserving strength but ceding ground. The cumulative effect was a gradual compression of the defensive perimeter. Maps in the command post were updated constantly, marked with pencil lines that moved inland by small but consistent increments. On June 17th, American forces continued advancing toward key terrain features, including airfields and road junctions. Tanks played a visible role in these movements. They advanced along cleared routes, halted to engage suspected positions, and resumed movement with minimal delay. Engineers accompanied them, filling craters and clearing obstacles. The tempo of operations contrasted sharply with Japanese expectations of slower, more cautious armor deployment. Within staff discussions, the tone remained outwardly confident but increasingly strained. Senior officers emphasized perseverance and adherence to doctrine. References to tank vulnerability continued, often citing isolated successes rather than the broader pattern. Tanaka noted these discussions without comment, aware that questioning established assumptions was neither customary nor encouraged. Yet empirical evidence accumulated. Reports indicated that American tanks were not only numerous but well maintained. Mechanical failures were less frequent than anticipated, and damaged vehicles were often recovered and repaired quickly. The logistical apparatus supporting American armor appeared robust, even under fire. Fuel and ammunition shortages that plagued Japanese units were not evident on the opposing side. The growing tension between doctrine and observed reality became most apparent during a coordinated counterattack launched on the evening of June 17th. Several Japanese units attempted to exploit perceived gaps between American positions. The plan relied on surprise and close combat, with the expectation that tanks would withdraw under threat. Instead, American forces responded with concentrated fire. Tanks advanced to block approaches, using their mobility to reposition rapidly. The attack failed to achieve its objectives, resulting in significant casualties. Tanaka reviewed the reports the following morning. The language remained formal and restrained, but the content was clear. Tank engagements were no longer incidental, they were central to the American method of advance. The Shermans were not merely supporting infantry, but shaping the battlefield by suppressing defenses and enabling maneuver.
Despite this, official communications upward emphasized endurance and eventual attrition of the enemy. References to material imbalance were avoided. The belief persisted that American forces would suffer unacceptable losses over time. This outlook reflected institutional experience rather than current conditions. As days passed, the pattern repeated. Japanese counterattacks achieved limited local successes but failed to disrupt the overall advance. American armor continued operating with consistency. Tanaka observed that tanks were increasingly used to exploit breakthroughs rather than simply support frontal assaults. Once a position was weakened, armor moved through quickly, forcing Japanese units to retreat or risk encirclement. By June 19th, the defensive situation had deteriorated further. The loss of key terrain reduced options for maneuver. Supply routes were disrupted and ammunition stocks dwindled. In contrast, American forces expanded their logistical footprint ashore. Tanks that had landed days earlier were joined by additional vehicles, reinforcing the impression of abundance. Tanaka's responsibilities shifted subtly. In addition to routine reporting, he was tasked with compiling assessments of enemy tactics. These documents required careful wording. Observations had to align with accepted doctrine while acknowledging practical challenges. Tanaka described the effectiveness of American combined arms without explicitly challenging prior assumptions about armor vulnerability. The strain between official doctrine and battlefield reality was increasingly difficult to ignore. Junior officers shared concerns privately, noting that tanks were present in greater numbers and operated with greater coordination than expected. However, such discussions rarely reached formal channels. The operational problem facing Japanese defenders was no longer limited to stopping individual tanks. It encompassed a broader inability to disrupt an integrated system. Armor, infantry, artillery, and air support functioned together, reducing opportunities for isolated engagements. The Shermans, once regarded as manageable threats, now appeared as persistent elements of a sustained offensive. As June progressed, Tanaka recognized that the assumptions underpinning coastal defense planning were failing. The belief that American armor could be neutralized by determination and sacrifice alone did not account for scale, coordination, and logistical support. These realizations remained largely internal, unexpressed in official reports. By the end of the second week of fighting, Japanese forces on Saipan faced a narrowing set of options. The gap between doctrine and reality had widened, creating uncertainty within the command structure. While official communications continued to stress resilience, the practical challenges posed by American armored forces were undeniable. The situation had escalated beyond initial expectations. What had begun as confidence in established methods now confronted sustained evidence to the contrary, setting the stage for difficult decisions ahead.
By late June 1944, the Battle for Saipan had reached a critical phase. American forces had secured much of the western coastline and were pushing steadily inland toward the island's central high ground. Japanese units were increasingly fragmented, operating under reduced communication and mounting shortages. The defensive framework established before the landings no longer corresponded to the realities on the ground. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka remained attached to regimental staff elements that now operated from improvised positions rather than established command posts. Maps were updated less frequently, not because the situation had stabilized, but because reliable information was harder to obtain. Air attacks and artillery fire disrupted movement, and surviving telephone lines were limited to short stretches. Orders were often delivered verbally, increasing the risk of misunderstanding. The persistence of American armor continued to shape operations. Sherman tanks appeared regularly in reports, sometimes singly, often in groups. They were no longer described merely as support for infantry assaults. Instead, they were noted as initiators of movement, advancing first to test resistance before infantry followed. This inversion of expectations unsettled Japanese planners accustomed to infantry-led engagements. On June 21, Tanaka accompanied a small group of officers tasked with observing a sector near a partially destroyed village. Their assignment was to assess whether a local counterattack could be organized to disrupt an American advance toward a road junction. From concealed positions, they watched American units consolidate their hold on the area. Tanks moved forward cautiously, halting to fire at suspected positions before proceeding. Infantry advanced in short bounds, maintaining close proximity to the armor. What Tanaka observed differed markedly from earlier assumptions conveyed in training materials. The tanks did not rush forward blindly. They paused, repositioned, and coordinated with infantry in supporting fire. When resistance was encountered, tanks withdrew slightly, allowing artillery or mortars to engage before resuming movement. The process was deliberate rather than impulsive. The Japanese units available for a counterattack were limited in number and equipment. Anti-tank weapons consisted primarily of field guns with restricted ammunition and infantry teams equipped for close assault. The proposed plan mirrored established doctrine: allow tanks to advance into prepared zones, then engage them at close range while infantry attacked supporting troops. Tanaka participated in planning discussions that afternoon. The officers present recognized the risks but lacked alternatives. Supplies were insufficient for prolonged defense, and withdrawal routes were narrowing. The counterattack was approved with minor adjustments, largely adhering to existing doctrine. That night, Japanese units moved into position. Terrain that had once offered concealment now bore the scars of bombardment. Vegetation was sparse, and the ground was uneven with craters. As the attack commenced, American forces responded quickly. Artillery fire illuminated the area, exposing movement. Tanks moved forward to reinforce threatened points, their engines audible even under shell fire. Tanaka received reports as the engagement unfolded. Initial contact achieved limited success against American infantry, but tanks soon intervened. Their machine guns and main guns suppressed assault teams before they could close distance. Attempts to flank were met with preemptive fire, suggesting effective coordination and communication among American units. The counterattack failed to alter the operational situation. Japanese units withdrew with losses, some fragmenting in the process. Tanaka documented the outcome in restrained language, noting the difficulty of approaching armored vehicles under sustained fire. The report avoided explicit criticism of doctrine, but implicitly acknowledged its limitations. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. Japanese commanders continued issuing orders based on established principles, while American forces exploited mobility and coordination. Tanks were used not only in assaults, but also in defensive roles, blocking counterattacks and securing captured ground. Their presence constrained Japanese movement even when not actively advancing. Tanaka's perspective evolved gradually. He did not abandon his training or beliefs, but he began to recognize discrepancies between theoretical vulnerability and practical resilience. The Sherman tank, while not impervious, was integrated into a system that compensated for its weaknesses. Mechanical reliability, logistical support, and tactical coordination reduced opportunities for decisive engagement. These realizations remained largely personal. Within formal channels, Tanaka adhered to required language and structure. However, in informal exchanges with peers, he acknowledged the challenges posed by American armor. Such discussions were cautious, framed as observations rather than critiques. As American forces advanced toward the island's northern areas, Japanese units faced increasing isolation. Terrain became more rugged, limiting large-scale tank movement but not eliminating armor's influence. Tanks supported infantry along roads and valleys, while artillery and air power compensated where armor could not operate directly. On June 27, Tanaka was reassigned temporarily to assist in coordinating defensive efforts near a ridge overlooking an approach route. From this position, he observed a prolonged engagement in which American tanks provided sustained fire support rather than direct assault. They remained behind infantry lines, engaging targets identified by forward observers. This use of armor contrasted with earlier expectations of aggressive tank-led charges. The engagement ended with Japanese units withdrawing under pressure. The ridge was eventually abandoned, not due to a single decisive action, but through cumulative attrition. Tanaka noted that tanks played a consistent, stabilizing role for American forces, enabling them to maintain pressure without overextending.
By the end of June, the Japanese defense on Saipan had entered a phase characterized by improvisation rather than planning. Command structures persisted, but their ability to shape events diminished. Tanaka's duties became increasingly reactive, focused on documenting losses and relaying fragmented orders. The turning point in Tanaka's understanding was not a single moment, but an accumulation of evidence. The assumption that American tanks could be neutralized through courage and close assault did not align with observed outcomes. The Sherman's effectiveness derived not from imperviousness, but from integration within a broader operational framework. This realization did not immediately translate to action. Institutional inertia and limited resources constrained responses. However, it influenced how Tanaka interpreted events and recorded them. His reports began emphasizing coordination and scale rather than individual engagements. As July approached, the battle's trajectory was clear. American forces retained momentum, supported by armor that continued to function despite losses. Japanese units prepared for continued resistance under increasingly constrained conditions. The acknowledgement of misjudgment remained unspoken in official doctrine, but for officers like Tanaka, it had become an unavoidable part of understanding the situation they faced.
By early July 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan had been compressed into a shrinking northern perimeter. The loss of airfields and road networks limited mobility and made coordinated defense increasingly difficult. Command structures formally remained in place, but their capacity to influence events had narrowed. Orders were issued, received, and often rendered obsolete within hours by changes on the ground. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka now worked from temporary positions that shifted frequently to avoid detection. His responsibilities focused on maintaining situational awareness and relaying directives between dispersed units. The administrative clarity of earlier weeks had been replaced by improvisation. Paper records were incomplete, and verbal orders carried greater weight than written plans. American operations continued with consistent pressure. Tanks remained present despite the more restrictive terrain in the island's northern sector. While steep slopes and dense undergrowth limited their movement, Shermans were still employed along accessible routes and in fire support roles. Where tanks could not advance, their guns and machine guns provided sustained support from fixed positions. Japanese attempts to counter this approach met with limited success. Artillery ammunition was scarce, and many guns had been lost or abandoned. Infantry units lacked the strength to mount effective counterattacks. Close assault tactics against tanks remained theoretically viable, but practically difficult to execute under constant observation and fire. Tanaka observed these challenges during an engagement near a narrow valley used by American forces as an advance route. Japanese units attempted to exploit terrain to approach American positions undetected. However, tanks positioned at the valley's mouth provided covering fire, limiting movement and exposing assault teams. The engagement ended with Japanese withdrawal after limited contact. In staff discussions, frustration was evident but rarely expressed openly. Senior officers emphasized perseverance and adherence to orders from higher command. The possibility of altering tactics significantly was constrained by shortages and the expectation of compliance with established doctrine. Tanaka noted that references to American tanks had shifted subtly in tone. They were no longer dismissed outright, but described as obstacles requiring careful consideration. The strain between observed reality and institutional expectations grew more pronounced. Reports sent upward continued to frame engagements within doctrinal language, emphasizing enemy losses and acts of bravery. However, the cumulative effect of repeated failures against armored supported advances was increasingly difficult to obscure. American forces adapted as well. Tanks were used conservatively, avoiding unnecessary exposure while maintaining pressure. They supported infantry advances incrementally, securing ground before moving forward again. This method reduced vulnerability and preserved combat power. For Japanese defenders, it meant fewer opportunities to exploit mistakes. Tanaka's position placed him close enough to observe these patterns repeatedly. He recorded the consistency with which tanks appeared at critical moments, reinforcing threatened sectors or exploiting openings. Their presence influenced Japanese decision-making even when they did not advance directly. Units hesitated to move in daylight, anticipating armored response. As the situation deteriorated, some Japanese officers expressed concern privately about the effectiveness of existing tactics. These discussions remained informal, often occurring during brief lulls in fighting. Tanaka participated cautiously, aware of the risks associated with overt criticism. The consensus among peers was not that American tanks were invulnerable, but that the conditions required to defeat them rarely materialized. On July 5, American forces initiated a coordinated push against remaining Japanese positions in the north. Tanks supported infantry advances along limited routes, while artillery and air support suppressed surrounding areas. Japanese units attempted to hold ridgelines and caves, relying on natural defenses rather than constructed fortifications. Tanaka assisted in coordinating defensive measures in this sector. His role involved compiling intelligence on enemy movements and, by early July 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan had been compressed into a shrinking northern perimeter. The loss of airfields and road networks limited mobility and made coordinated defense increasingly difficult. Command structures formally remained in place, but their capacity to influence events had narrowed. Orders were issued, received, and often rendered obsolete within hours by changes on the ground. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka now worked from temporary positions that shifted frequently to avoid detection. His responsibilities focused on maintaining situational awareness and relaying directives between dispersed units. The administrative clarity of earlier weeks had been replaced by improvisation. Paper records were incomplete, and verbal orders carried greater weight than written plans. American operations continued with consistent pressure. Tanks remained present despite the more restrictive terrain in the island's northern sector. While steep slopes and dense undergrowth limited their movement, Shermans were still employed along accessible routes and in fire support roles. Where tanks could not advance, their guns and machine guns provided sustained support from fixed positions. Japanese attempts to counter this approach met with limited success. Artillery ammunition was scarce, and many guns had been lost or abandoned. Infantry units lacked the strength to mount effective counterattacks. Close assault tactics against tanks remained theoretically viable, but practically difficult to execute under constant observation and fire. Tanaka observed these challenges during an engagement near a narrow valley used by American forces as an advance route. Japanese units attempted to exploit terrain to approach American positions undetected. However, tanks positioned at the valley's mouth provided covering fire, limiting movement and exposing assault teams. The engagement ended with Japanese withdrawal after limited contact. In staff discussions, frustration was evident but rarely expressed openly. Senior officers emphasized perseverance and adherence to orders from higher command. The possibility of altering tactics significantly was constrained by shortages and the expectation of compliance with established doctrine. Tanaka noted that references to American tanks had shifted subtly in tone. They were no longer dismissed outright, but described as obstacles requiring careful consideration. The strain between observed reality and institutional expectations grew more pronounced. Reports sent upward continued to frame engagements within doctrinal language, emphasizing enemy losses and acts of bravery. However, the cumulative effect of repeated failures against armored supported advances was increasingly difficult to obscure. American forces adapted as well. Tanks were used conservatively, avoiding unnecessary exposure while maintaining pressure. They supported infantry advances incrementally, securing ground before moving forward again. This method reduced vulnerability and preserved combat power. For Japanese defenders, it meant fewer opportunities to exploit mistakes. Tanaka's position placed him close enough to observe these patterns repeatedly. He recorded the consistency with which tanks appeared at critical moments, reinforcing threatened sectors or exploiting openings. Their presence influenced Japanese decision-making even when they did not advance directly. Units hesitated to move in daylight, anticipating armored response. As the situation deteriorated, some Japanese officers expressed concern privately about the effectiveness of existing tactics. These discussions remained informal, often occurring during brief lulls in fighting. Tanaka participated cautiously, aware of the risks associated with overt criticism. The consensus among peers was not that American tanks were invulnerable, but that the conditions required to defeat them rarely materialized. On July 5th, American forces initiated a coordinated push against remaining Japanese positions in the north. Tanks supported infantry advances along limited routes, while artillery and air support suppressed surrounding areas. Japanese units attempted to hold ridgelines and caves, relying on natural defenses rather than constructed fortifications. Tanaka assisted in coordinating defensive measures in this sector. His role involved compiling intelligence on enemy movements and distributing orders for withdrawal or repositioning. The pace of events left little room for detailed planning. Decisions were made quickly, often based on incomplete information. During one engagement, Tanaka observed tanks firing into cave entrances identified by infantry. The method was systematic rather than hurried. Once resistance diminished, infantry moved forward, followed by tanks repositioning to support the next phase. The sequence repeated with minimal deviation. Japanese resistance slowed the advance but did not stop it. Casualties mounted, and the defensive perimeter contracted further. The influence of American armor, while less dramatic during the initial landings, remained significant. Tanks provided a stable base of fire and psychological pressure, reinforcing the sense of inevitability among defenders. Within the Japanese command structure, acknowledgement of the situation remained limited. Orders emphasized honor and endurance rather than tactical adaptation. Tanaka noted the absence of directives addressing the specific challenges posed by sustained armored support. The assumption persisted that determination could compensate for material disadvantage. As days passed, the gap between institutional expectation and battlefield reality widened more. Tanaka continued performing his duties, documenting events with precision and restraint. His reports reflected observed patterns without explicit judgment. However, the underlying recognition of miscalculation was evident in the emphasis placed on coordination and scale rather than individual acts. By mid-July, organized resistance on Saipan was nearing collapse. Remaining Japanese units prepared for final defensive actions under conditions of extreme scarcity. American forces maintained pressure, supported by armor that continued functioning despite losses. For Tanaka, the experience underscored the consequences of underestimating an opponent's material and organizational capacity. The Sherman tank, once regarded as a manageable threat, had proven effective not through inherent superiority alone, but through integration within a sustained operational system. The stakes had reached their peak. Japanese forces faced annihilation or capture, while American units advanced toward final objectives. The decisions made earlier in the campaign, informed by assumptions about armor, now revealed their limitations. As the battle entered its final phase, the outcomes of these assumptions became unavoidable. By mid-July 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan had effectively ceased as a coherent defensive system. What remained were isolated groups of soldiers, cut off from supply and command, occupying caves, ravines, and broken terrain in the island's northern reaches. American forces consolidated their control methodically, securing ground already taken rather than advancing rapidly. The tempo reflected operational confidence rather than urgency. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka's duties during this period were reduced in scope but not in burden. With formal command structures fractured, his role shifted to assisting in the orderly destruction of documents, relaying final directives where possible, and maintaining records that might survive the battle. Administrative discipline persisted even as military control faded. For officers trained to value structure, these tasks provided a sense of continuity amid collapse. American armored units remained active until the final stages. Sherman tanks supported infantry operations against remaining pockets of resistance, often acting as mobile fire platforms rather than assault vehicles. Their presence limited Japanese movement and reduced the need for costly frontal attacks. Tanks fired into cave entrances, collapsed defensive positions, and withdrew once resistance ended. This measured use reflected an emphasis on minimizing losses rather than achieving dramatic breakthroughs. For Japanese defenders, opportunities to engage tanks directly were rare. Close assault tactics, once emphasized in training, were impractical under sustained observation and fire. The conditions required for success, surprise, proximity, and isolation, were seldom present. Instead, tanks operated within a protected envelope of infantry, artillery, and air support. Their vulnerability existed in theory but was mitigated in practice. Tanaka observed these final engagements from a distance. He noted the absence of urgency in American movements. Tanks advanced when needed, halted when resistance diminished, and repositioned efficiently. The contrast with Japanese conditions was stark. Supplies were exhausted, communications intermittent, and options limited. The imbalance extended beyond equipment to organization and endurance. On July 9th, American commanders declared Saipan secured, though mopping-up operations continued. The formal end of organized resistance did not immediately change Tanaka's situation. Like many Japanese officers, he remained with remnants of his unit, awaiting orders that would never arrive. The psychological weight of defeat settled gradually, reinforced by the quiet efficiency with which American forces consolidated control. In the aftermath, Tanaka reflected privately on the campaign's assumptions. The belief that American armor could be neutralized through determination and close combat had not accounted for scale or integration. Sherman tanks had not been decisive individually, but their sustained presence shaped the battlefield consistently. They enabled American forces to apply pressure steadily, reducing the effectiveness of improvised countermeasures. These reflections remained personal. Japanese military culture discouraged retrospective critique during wartime, and opportunities to express such views were limited. Tanaka's surviving records, where they existed, focused on chronology and observation rather than interpretation. However, the emphasis he placed on coordination, logistics, and combined arms suggested an implicit reassessment. For the American forces, the battle reinforced existing doctrine. Tanks were confirmed as effective when employed in coordination with infantry, engineers, artillery, and air support. Losses were acknowledged, but they did not disrupt operations. The Sherman tank, often criticized for its limitations, proved sufficient within a system designed to compensate for those weaknesses. Institutionally, the Japanese army conducted limited internal analysis after the campaign, constrained by the war's progression. Lessons regarding armored warfare were noted but could not be implemented at scale due to industrial and logistical constraints. The gap between understanding and capability widened as the war continued. Tanaka survived the battle and the war. In post-war years, like many former officers, he lived quietly, his experiences largely unrecorded outside official histories. His role had not been that of a battlefield commander or strategist, but of an observer within a system confronting its limits. His perspective represented a broader, often unspoken recognition among Japanese officers who faced materially superior forces. The story of American Sherman tanks on Saipan is not one of mockery reversed through spectacle. It is a record of assumptions tested by sustained operations. Japanese officers who dismissed the tank did so based on incomplete experience and constrained perspective. The reality they encountered was not invulnerability, but persistence. machines supported by organization, supply, and doctrine. In this context, the Sherman tank was neither flawless nor decisive alone. Its effectiveness derived from repetition and reliability. Hundreds did not roll ashore at once to overwhelm defenders dramatically. They arrived steadily, were repaired when damaged, and returned to service. This continuity mattered more than any single engagement. For individuals like Tanaka, the lesson was implicit rather than declared. The war exposed the consequences of underestimating an opponent's capacity to sustain effort over time. The recognition came too late to alter outcomes, but remains visible in the careful observations preserved in surviving records. Today, the events on Saipan are often summarized in strategic terms: airfields secured, bombers deployed, lines advanced. Less attention is given to the quiet realizations of those who witnessed the erosion of assumptions under sustained pressure. Their experiences offer insight into how wars are lost not only through defeat in battle, but through misjudgment of scale and endurance. If you value historically grounded accounts that focus on overlooked perspectives rather than simplified narratives, consider supporting this channel so more stories like this can be told with care and restraint.